It began like a dream, the kind of story couples imagine when they close their eyes and picture forever. A glowing bride, a handsome groom, the ocean shimmering like liquid glass, and the promise of new beginnings etched into the horizon. But within just 9 days of boarding the ship, that dream would be shattered. One of them would vanish, not into thin air, but into the black depths of the sea. No witnesses, no body, just a trail of blood and a lifetime of questions. George Smith boarded the cruise as a newlywed. By the end of the voyage, he would be a ghost. George and Jennifer Smith were the kind of couple people couldn't help but envy. George, tall, athletic, full of energy, was the embodiment of youthful charm. He came from a loving, tight-knit family in Greenwich, Connecticut, and was poised to take over his father's successful liquor store business. He had a way of lighting up a room without trying, a warm smile, and the kind of easy charisma that made everyone feel like they'd known him forever. Jennifer, an aspiring elementary school teacher, had the same magnetic energy. She was smart, lively, and beautiful, the kind of person you couldn't help but notice when she walked into a room. After a 3-year relationship, they had tied the knot in a lavish, coastal wedding that could have been pulled from the pages of a bridal magazine. The ceremony took place in Newport, Rhode Island, under soft, golden light with the Atlantic as their backdrop. Family and friends toasted their future with glasses of champagne. There were tears, laughter, and vows exchanged under the open sky. George's sister remembered how excited they both were to leave for their honeymoon, a Mediterranean cruise that would take them to the most breathtaking ports in Europe. Jennifer, in particular, was thrilled. It would be her first time traveling overseas. They were young, in love, and floating, both literally and figuratively, in a kind of newlywed euphoria. On June 29, 2005, the Smiths boarded Royal Caribbean's Brilliance of the Seas in Barcelona. The ship, a 90,000-ton floating palace, was designed for luxury, sparkling casinos, fine dining, lavish entertainment, and the deep blue stretching endlessly on all sides. It was the perfect place to begin a new life together. On board, they quickly made friends, other honeymooners like Paul and Galina Kitnitsky, and a group of young men, mostly Russian-American college students, who seemed friendly and eager to party. Everyone on board recalled how happy George and Jennifer seemed. They took photos constantly, explored ports arm in arm, and laughed over cocktails late into the night. To everyone watching, they were simply a beautiful young couple in the early bloom of marriage. But beneath the smiles and photo ops, subtle cracks were forming, ones that only a few would notice, and even fewer would survive to recall. There were moments of tension, flashes of alcohol-fueled conflict, and strange interactions with other passengers. George, according to his new friends, didn't hold his liquor well. He was charming and fun when sober, but after a few drinks, his inhibitions lowered, and so did his awareness. Still, nothing seemed out of the ordinary at the time. After all, it was a honeymoon. It was a cruise. People partied. In truth, everything seemed ordinary. Until it wasn't. The last time anyone saw George alive was the night of July 4th, as the ship floated off the coast of Turkey. He had spent hours in the casino with Jennifer and their circle of cruise friends. Security cameras captured him laughing, drinking, and later slumped over in a chair, clearly intoxicated, around 3 a.m. Several of the young men escorted George back to his cabin. Jennifer wasn't with him. She would later be found passed out in a hallway, unable to recall how she got there. When crew members tried to page the Smiths the next morning, there was no answer. Then came the discovery. A teenage passenger stepped onto her balcony around sunrise and noticed something horrific below her. On the white canopy above the lifeboats, a massive bloodstain. It was unmistakable. And it hadn't been there the night before. What had started as a celebration of love was now a crime scene. Within hours, whispers spread across the ship. A passenger was missing and newlywed, a young man with a life ahead. of him, ship security and Turkish police began an investigation. But it was already too late. Whatever had happened that night, whether accidental, intentional, or something in between, had already sunk into the ocean, dragging clarity and justice down with it. George Allen Smith Ivy was gone. Just 9 days into his marriage, he had vanished without a trace. And for those left behind, his wife, his family, his friends, the nightmare was just beginning. Before he became the center of one of the most mysterious disappearances in modern cruise history, George Allen Smith IV was simply known as George, a son, a brother, a friend, and to many, a young man with everything going for him. He was the kind of person who didn't just walk into a room, he filled it. At 6'4", with broad shoulders, a warm smile, and an easy, natural charisma, George had a presence that made people stop and take notice. But it wasn't just his looks that stood out. He was kind, he was funny, he was the type of guy who would sit with you over a beer and make you laugh until your stomach hurt. Born and raised in the affluent town of Greenwich, Connecticut, George grew up in a close-knit, loving family. His parents, George III and Maureen Smith, poured their lives into raising their children with strong values, big dreams, and even bigger hearts. George was the baby of the family, the youngest of 3, and his bond with his mother and sister. Bree was especially strong. His mother would later say that no matter where he was in the world, George would call her almost every day just to hear her voice, to ask how she was, to tell her he loved her. To them, George wasn't just a son. He was a best friend. As he entered adulthood, George was preparing to take the next big step in his life, running the family business. His father had spent decades building up a successful liquor store in town, and George had big plans to carry it forward. But he didn't just want to manage it. He wanted to modernize it, expand it, and make it something new. His father often joked that George was the tech guy in the operation, always pushing for new ideas, online sales, digital systems, things his old-school mind hadn't considered. Together, they made an unlikely team. He always called me the old man, his father recalled with a laugh. I was the dinosaur he had to deal with, but beneath the teasing was a deep respect. George's enthusiasm wasn't just youthful energy. It was vision. It was ambition. He was ready for more. And just when everything seemed to be falling into place professionally, George met someone who would change his life forever. Jennifer Hagel, a beautiful, spirited, and fiercely intelligent young woman from Cromwell, Connecticut, walked into George's life like a whirlwind. The two were instantly drawn to each other. Jennifer was warm, funny, and outgoing, the perfect counterpart to George's playful charm. She was studying to become a schoolteacher with dreams of shaping young minds. They shared a love for adventure, for conversation, for dreaming big. After a 3-year relationship, George proposed, and the wedding that followed was nothing short of breathtaking. The Smiths spared no expense. Set against the coastal cliffs of Newport, the ceremony overlooked the Atlantic Ocean, an unspoken symbol of vast new beginnings. The reception was lively, elegant, and filled with joy. George's older sister remembered the glow on his face that day, how excited he and Jennifer were to start their life together. The marriage didn't just feel right, it felt like destiny. The cruise was meant to be their reward, a luxurious, once-in-a-lifetime honeymoon through the Mediterranean's most iconic cities. George had always loved history, culture, and good food. Jennifer was eager to experience new places. They planned to visit Spain, Italy, Greece, and Turkey, a whirlwind of experiences and memories to set the tone for the rest of their life. Family and friends waved goodbye as they boarded the flight to Barcelona, completely unaware that it would be the last time they'd see George alive. It's important to understand who George was, not because it makes his disappearance more tragic, though it does, but because it makes it more real. He wasn't just a headline. He wasn't just a missing person. He was a man on the verge of everything, building a future, a family, a legacy. And then, in a single night, it all disappeared. When people speak about George today, they don't talk about him in the past tense. His family still feels his presence. His friends still hear his laugh. His father still sees him behind the counter of the store, cracking jokes about customers. And his mother still listens for his voice when the phone rings. He was the light in their lives, and when that light went out, it left behind not just darkness, but a deep, consuming silence. George Smith Ivey wasn't perfect, but he was loved. And that's what makes his disappearance not just a mystery, but a wound, one that refuses to heal, one that bleeds through every memory, every photo, and every unanswered question. He was a rising star. And then, without warning, he was gone. Asterisk. The brilliance of the seas was a marvel of modern luxury, a floating city dressed in marble floors, golden chandeliers, and sweeping ocean views from every deck. When George and Jennifer boarded the cruise ship in late June 2005, it must have felt like stepping into a dream. Their honeymoon was set to unfold across the Mediterranean, stops in Barcelona, Naples, Mykonos, Ephesus. Days would be spent wandering cobblestone streets and sunlit ruins. Nights would end with cocktails, laughter, and the soft rocking of the waves beneath their feet. To outsiders, they looked like any young couple in love, soaking up the early magic of marriage. Cruise photos captured them smiling, arms around each other, posing by grand staircases and sunlit balconies. The Mediterranean wind ran through Jennifer's hair. George, tall and confident, had his arm protectively around her waist. They were two people completely unaware that history was unfolding around them, not the kind that's written in guidebooks, but the kind that ends up as a mystery, locked forever in shadow. It didn't take long for George and Jennifer to make friends aboard the ship. One of the first couples they connected with was Paul and Galina Kidnitsky, fellow honeymooners who shared the same sense of adventure. The two couples quickly became inseparable. They dined together, explored ports together, even gambled together at the ship's casino. In their company, George and Jennifer seemed completely at ease, laughing, enjoying the rhythm of the voyage, blending into the relaxed, festive energy that cruise life creates. But it wasn't just the Kidnitskys. They got to know there was another group, younger, rowdier, and harder to read. Russian-American college students, Greg and Zach Rosenberg, Rusty Kaufman, and a California student named Josh Assen. They were loud, confident, and constantly drinking. Some passengers avoided them altogether. Others, like George and Jennifer, welcomed the company. On a ship packed with strangers, even brief connections can feel like fast friendships. But in hindsight, it would be these names, these casual acquaintances, that would form the core of the storm to come. The days passed in a blur of sightseeing and celebration. George, ever the socialite, thrived in the atmosphere. He loved talking to people, playing games, staying up late. Jennifer, warm and outgoing in her own right, matched his energy step for step. But there were early signs of imbalance, cracks that, to most, looked like nothing at the time. According to several passengers, George didn't have a high tolerance for alcohol. A few beers in, and his easygoing charm would give way to slurred words, stumbling steps, and a glazed look in his eyes. Jennifer, too, was drinking, sometimes heavily. Friends recall seeing her visibly intoxicated on multiple nights, sometimes argumentative, sometimes simply dazed. Still, no one was worried. After all, it was a honeymoon. Who wasn't drinking? And cruise life has a way of disarming people. The constant movement, the all-you-can-eat buffets, the neon glow of the casino, the white noise of waves, it lulls passengers into a false sense of safety. But behind the laughter and luxury, the ship was also a floating trap. There were no police, no surveillance on every hallway, no one checking who entered which cabin at 3 a.m. The illusion of paradise concealed a simple truth. On the open sea, anything can happen, and no one may ever know. By July 4th, George and Jennifer had settled into a rhythm. Casino nights had become a routine. They were known among staff and other passengers. Some saw them as friendly and charming, others, quietly, had begun to notice tension. George flashing his expensive bridling watch. Jennifer wandering off from her husband during nights out. Loud voices behind cabin doors, little things, but no one imagined it was anything more than the usual growing pains of young love. That night, July 4th, 2005, the ship made its way toward the Turkish port city of Kusadasi. Fireworks lit the sky above American shores thousands of miles away. But on board, the celebration took a darker turn. In the casino, George was drinking again, heavily. Jennifer was at the blackjack table, George at the craps table. Security cameras captured both of them playing separately, each surrounded by different people. At some point, the Russian-American group joined George, drinks flowed, jokes were made. But no one, not Jennifer, not the Kidnitskys, not even the men who surrounded him, could have predicted that this would be the last time George Smith would ever be seen alive. Later that night, George stumbled back to his cabin, not alone, but helped by the same men who'd spent the night drinking with him. Jennifer was nowhere in sight. She would later be found unconscious in a hallway, disoriented, unable to remember where her husband was. What happened in the hours between their casino farewell and that bloodstain on the lifeboat canopy remains the darkest riddle in this story, because something happened that night on the brilliance of the seas, something violent, something final, and once it started, there was no turning back. Morning came quietly aboard the brilliance of the seas. The Mediterranean sun had just begun to rise over the coastline of Kusadasi, Turkey. For most passengers, it was another day in paradise, another port, another excursion. But for 16-year-old Emily Rausch, what she saw when she stepped onto her balcony that morning would stay with her for the rest of her life. It was supposed to be a simple photo, a beautiful sunrise on a foreign coast. But just as Emily raised her camera, something on the white metal canopy below caught her eye. At first, she thought it was rust, a stain, maybe spilt paint. But when she zoomed in, her stomach dropped. It was blood, a large, unmistakable blotch of deep red, smearing across the lifeboat awning beneath her, glowing sickly under the morning light. She called for her parents. Staff was alerted, and within minutes, the ship's quiet morning routine had shifted into something far more urgent. Word began to spread, slowly and uncertainly, that someone might have gone overboard. Ship security attempted to do a cabin check, starting with the room directly above the state. Cabin 9062, the Smith's room. There was no answer. The stateroom attendant knocked again. Still nothing. He paged their names over the ship's internal system. George and Jennifer Smith, please report to guest relations. No response. Another crew member cleaning nearby advised checking inside the room. At first glance, it looked like a normal cabin, but a few steps in, it became clear this was anything but normal. The bed sheets bore thin streaks of blood, not splatters, but smears, as if something or someone had been dragged. Furniture appeared moved out. A suitcase was overturned, and on the balcony, traces of blood ran along the railing. It was now painfully clear. This wasn't an accident waiting to happen. Something violent had already occurred. Security was tightened. Turkish police were called to board the ship. The forensic investigation, as limited as it was uninternational, waters began. Meanwhile, Jennifer Smith was located. She had been found hours earlier, passed out in a hallway outside someone else's cabin, confused, disoriented, and unaware that her husband was already gone. When she was told George was missing, her reaction was a mixture of panic and disbelief. "I don't remember," she kept repeating. "I just don't remember." She claimed she had no recollection of what had happened after leaving the disco. In her mind, she assumed George had stayed out later. Perhaps he had slept at Paul and Galina's room. It wasn't unusual, she said, for them to split up at night. But this wasn't just another night, and when she was told about the blood, her face went pale. The investigation now turned to those who had last seen George the same group of young men who had helped him back to his cabin. They were gathered, separated, questioned. One of them, Rusty Kaufman, was visibly shocked. When told about the blood, another, Josh Assen, quickly became defensive, demanding to know if they were being accused of something. At this point, no one knew what had really happened, but everyone knew something was very, very wrong. The Smith family, back home in Connecticut, received the call no parent should ever have to answer. It came not from the cruise line, but from Jennifer's father. George is missing, he said. They think he fell overboard. George's mother, Maureen, said the words didn't feel real. Her mind rejected them. George, missing. He had just called her the day before. He was happy. He was alive. There had to be some mistake, but there was no mistake. Her son, her baby boy, had vanished in the night. Yet, even as they tried to comprehend the loss, the Smiths hadn't been told the full truth. Not about the bloodstain, not about the broken furniture, not about the reports of yelling, crashing, and a sudden thud heard by multiple passengers in the early hours. Not about the rumors of a fight, not about the fact that Jennifer, the woman who had just become George's wife, was found unconscious and unable to recall the most critical hours of her life. The Turkish police, now on board, began conducting interviews and collecting what little evidence they could. But the ship was not a crime scene sealed by yellow tape. It was a moving vessel with over 2,000 people, dozens of ports, and a ticking clock. In less than 24 hours, all of it would be behind them, literally. Photographs were taken. Witnesses questioned, but no arrests were made. No one was detained, and the ship kept sailing. Back in the United States, media coverage had barely begun. The Smith family, reeling with grief, still believed George had fallen. But that belief would soon change once they saw the photos, once they heard the cabin recordings, once they heard the details Jennifer hadn't mentioned, because George Smith wasn't just missing. He wasn't just lost at sea. He was the victim of something darker. Something that, even now, remains shrouded in secrecy and silence. And for those who were there, for those who may know the truth, the clock had already started ticking. There was blood. There were bruises. There were lies. And yet, no justice. From the moment George Smith was declared missing, it was already too late. Not just in the literal sense that he was gone somewhere beneath the endless Mediterranean, but in the investigative sense as well. The crime scene, if that's what it truly was, had been compromised. Cabin 9060 had already been entered, touched, walked through. Any potential forensic evidence had been smeared, trampled, or worse, cleaned by the time Turkish authorities boarded the Brilliance of the seas that morning. The scene was no longer fresh. Still, they tried to salvage what they could. Photographs were taken of the cabin's interior. Bloodstains on the sheets, drawers pulled open, bottles scattered. The room looked like it had been ransacked, not with chaos, but with purpose. The balcony was of particular concern, especially the railing. The distance from the cabin's balcony to the canopy below wasn't far. Investigators quickly understood. If George had gone overboard, this was likely where it happened. But questions outnumbered answers. Where was the rest of the blood? Why had no one heard a scream? Why were there reports of shouting, slamming, and a loud thud just minutes before sunrise? And more importantly, who was in the room when it all happened? The Turkish police began interviewing those last seen with George, Josh Assen, and the Russian-American group, Greg and Zach Rosenberg, and Rusty Kaufman. These young men had reportedly helped George to his room around 3:52 a.m., claiming he was too drunk to stand on his own. According to them, Jennifer was missing, so they carried George into his room, laid him gently on the bed, took off his shoes, and left. But things didn't add up. First, multiple passengers on both sides of cabin 9060 heard shouting after that time. One of them, a deputy police chief from Ohio, was crystal clear in his recollection. He and his wife were awoken by what sounded like a loud drinking game. But the tone shifted quickly, from laughter to an argument, then a scuffle, and finally a single male voice shouting goodnight. Goodnight followed by silence. Then came the noise that would haunt witnesses for years, a heavy metallic thud, loud enough to wake people several doors down. Another guest said it sounded like furniture being thrown. Others described it as violent, but according to the men who escorted George, none of that happened. They claimed they left him peacefully, that no one remained behind, that they had returned to their own room and ordered food, a late-night room service binge. They said tuna sandwiches, cheeseburgers, a carefree detail that they hoped would prove they weren't involved in anything more sinister. But again, the evidence betrayed their story. Royal Caribbean records would later show that no food was ever ordered from their room. Yes, several short calls were placed to room service, but there were no confirmed orders, no delivery, no contact from staff. It was as if the calls were made only to plant an alibi, one that collapsed under even basic scrutiny. Even stranger was the behavior of the men during their interviews. One of them, Rusty Kaufman, appeared genuinely shocked when shown the photo of the blood on the lifeboat canopy. His reaction was human, disturbed, but others, like Josh Assen, grew defensive almost immediately. His tone shifted from confusion to frustration. He denied involvement, then refused to answer more questions. Later, when asked under oath if he knew what happened to George Smith, he invoked his Fifth Amendment right. Not just once, but repeatedly, even when asked his name. As days passed and the ship continued its route, the FBI joined the investigation. They were skeptical of nearly everything. George's disappearance wasn't just suspicious. It was surrounded by inconsistencies, contradictions, and outright silence. The agents reviewed ship logs, surveillance footage, keycard data. They reconstructed the timeline. The result? A chain of events full of missing minutes, broken alibis, and to many people who claimed they couldn't remember. And Jennifer, George's wife of just 9 days, remained at the center of the emotional chaos. She told investigators she had no memory of what happened after leaving the casino, that she woke up alone in a hallway, that she assumed George was with friends. But investigators weren't convinced. It wasn't just the memory loss, it was what she couldn't explain. Why didn't she ask where her husband was when she woke up? Why didn't she return to her cabin? Why wasn't she covered in blood if something had happened in the room they shared? Suspicions mounted against her, against the men, and against the cruise line itself. Meanwhile, the Smith family was in agony. They had lost their son, and now they were watching as the investigation unraveled in slow motion. Critical evidence was missing. Witnesses were slipping away, and the very people who might hold the answers were now protected by lawyers. George's parents began asking questions, hard ones. Why hadn't the ship been locked down immediately? Why wasn't Jennifer tested for alcohol or drugs? Why were passengers allowed to go home without further questioning? Why did so many key players suddenly stop cooperating once the FBI got involved? The truth was becoming harder and harder to find. The case, once burning hot, had already begun to cool. And with every hour that passed, it became clear whatever happened that night on the brilliance of the seas was disappearing with the tide. Lies can be rehearsed, alibis can be fabricated. Memories, real or fake, can fade or be manipulated, but hard evidence is harder to outrun. And in the mysterious case of George Smith, it was the evidence, not the suspects, that continued to speak the loudest. When the Smith family saw the first photo of the lifeboat canopy, stained with blood just beneath their son's cabin balcony, everything changed. This wasn't a man who fell. This wasn't a clumsy accident or a simple misstep after too much alcohol. It was too targeted, too violent, too human. And soon, even more troubling details would emerge, details that not only contradicted the suspects' stories, but exposed what they might have tried to erase. Inside cabin 9062, ship staff had documented several unusual things. First, the bed. On the white sheets were thin lines of blood, not in random splashes, but to clear, narrow smears, almost like streaks from someone's wrist or forearm. Not enough to suggest a violent struggle, but enough to prove contact with someone bleeding. Investigators and the Smith family's legal team would later propose an unsettling theory. The blood patterns matched what might happen if someone forcibly removed a wristwatch, especially one as large and tight-fitting as George's expensive bridling timepiece. Then there was the state of the room itself, drawers half opened, the minibar disturbed, items scattered on the floor. It didn't look like the aftermath of a drunken collapse. It looked like someone had been searching for something, a robbery, a cover-up. The Smiths believed it wasn't just possible, it was likely, and there was more, witness testimony that never quite aligned with the suspect's story. Ship records showed the four young men entered George's cabin at 3:52 a.m., but passengers in neighboring rooms heard disturbances after 4 a.m., including loud voices arguing, the sound of furniture being shoved, and the unmistakable noise of a body hitting metal, the lifeboat canopy. Crucially, one passenger, a vacationing deputy police chief, reported hearing multiple voices, then just one male voice alone in the room, and finally, silence. He said the men's claims that they had all left together didn't match what he heard through the thin cabin walls. And then came the alibi. The group insisted they had gone back to their own cabin and ordered room service. Not just once, but repeatedly, naming the food they allegedly ordered in detail. Tuna sandwiches, cheeseburgers, fries. They painted the scene like a college dorm after a night of partying, drunk, hungry, harmless. But when attorney Mike Jones finally acquired Royal Caribbean's internal documents, something didn't fit. While calls to room service had been made, there were no written records of food being ordered. No slips, no delivery logs, no confirmation from staff. It was as if the order never happened in a ship run with military precision, where every towel is counted and every call logged. The food that night had simply disappeared. So had the watch, George's expensive timepiece, the one he was known to flash in the casino, was gone. Not found in the cabin, not recovered in the ocean. Gone, as if removed intentionally. And what about the cash? According to some accounts, George and Jennifer had mentioned carrying several $1,000s in their stateroom. There's no official record of the exact amount, but the rumor had spread. In the closed ecosystem of a cruise ship, rumors move fast, and to someone looking for an opportunity, they might be all the motivation needed. Then came the most damning piece of evidence, a video not of the night George disappeared, but of what came after. Shot by the suspects themselves, hours later, in broad daylight. In the video, the men are sitting casually at lunch, passing around a handheld camera, joking, mocking the very idea that George had fallen to his death. One man, Rusty Kaufman, can be heard making a twisted joke about George parachute riding off his balcony. Another, believed to be Greg Rosenberg, strikes a pose, flashes gang signs, and brags, "Told you I was gangster." The tone isn't just callous. It's sinister. To the Smith family, this wasn't a prank. It was a confession, not in words, but in attitude. If they were innocent, why were they laughing? Why was George's death a punchline? Why did none of them express horror or concern? They weren't afraid of justice because they didn't think justice was coming. The FBI took the video seriously. But instead of leading to an arrest, it created more frustration. The suspects lawyered up. Depositions were flooded with don't recalls and constitutional silence. Even polygraph tests failed to clear them. Josh Assen reportedly failed his polygraph, though his lawyer claimed the results were unreliable. Rusty Kaufman's test raised similar questions. Greg Rosenberg's was inconclusive, though he later blamed ADHD and his inability to sit still for long. Despite this, no charges were filed. No arrests made. the suspects walked off the ship in Naples, escorted by their families, their lawyers. Waiting, what could have been the turning point in a murder investigation became a missed opportunity. But the Smiths didn't let go. They hired their own experts, pushed for access to records, offered a $100,000 reward. They weren't just mourning a loss, they were fighting a system that seemed determined to forget. Because the evidence, blood on the sheets, a missing watch, broken timelines, failed polygraphs, and that chilling video was not going away. And even if the suspects never spoke, the truth was still speaking, in silence, in stains, in laughter that sounded far too much like guilt. Some families grieve in private, quietly, tenderly, clinging to memories in photo albums and faded voicemails. But the Smiths were never given that peace. Because when your son vanishes on what should be the happiest week of his life, when you're handed an empty answer and a closed case, grief becomes something else. It becomes a mission, a crusade, a fight that never ends. George Allen Smith IV was more than a name on a case file. More than a tabloid headline. He was a son, a brother, a husband, a friend. He had dreams, he had a future, and he had a family. Who would not and will not let the world forget what happened to him? From the moment they received the call that George was missing, George and Maureen Smith turned their heartbreak into fuel. They pushed the FBI. They hired their own investigators. They held press conferences, filed lawsuits, sat across from powerful attorneys and demanded answers. For nearly 2 decades, they became the face of a fight that no one else wanted to keep waging, a fight not only for truth, but for dignity, because George didn't die quietly. He didn't vanish peacefully. Something brutal happened in cabin 9062, and someone knows why. Even after the FBI closed the case in 2015, the Smiths refused to quit. They combed through the 97,000 pages of redacted documents, pointing out every contradiction, every unanswered lead, every name that disappeared from the paperwork. They challenged Royal Caribbean, accusing the cruise line of failing to protect their passengers, of failing to preserve a crime scene, of allowing key witnesses to walk away without consequence. They believed the cruise company chose public relations over truth, and in many ways, they weren't wrong. Years passed, but the Smiths never let George's memory fade. In their home, his photos still hang. His voice still echoes. His birthday is still remembered. And every July 5th, while the rest of the country watches fireworks and celebrates freedom, they light candles not for celebration, but for remembrance. George's mother once said, "You can't look at the water and the sea without remembering what happened to George." For her, the ocean doesn't represent peace or escape. It represents loss, a silence that swallowed her son, a silence that still hasn't spoken, and yet hope remains, because every story told keeps George's memory alive. Every documentary, every article, every whisper shared online, they bring his name back into the light. Maybe one day, someone will speak, a conscience will crack, a memory will surface. A truth too long buried will finally rise. Until then, the Smiths continue to fight. For justice, for accountability, for the chance to stand over their son's grave and say, "We know what happened." Not just that he's gone, but how and why. And by his hands, because the real tragedy isn't just that George Smith died on his honeymoon. It's that, 2 decades later, no one has answered for it. And somewhere out there, someone is still carrying a secret heavier than the ocean itself. Asterisk.